énergétique des maisons et des bâtiments, aller vers un système ETS, c'est un système où on a, les émissions sont traitées dans un marché, on fait un système plus strict. Peut-être même élargir ce système au transport et au bâtiment. Comme ça, on peut arriver à moins 55% parce que c'est un enjeu incroyable. En fait, le moins 55%, on l'a mis dans une loi maintenant. Donc, on a l'obligation d'y arriver.
Il y a un secteur, et vous l'avez brièvement évoqué à présent, qui joue un rôle important dans les émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Une part même qui a tendance à augmenter, c'est le secteur du transport.
Oui.
Est-ce que vous avez une voiture, Frans Timmermans?
Oui.
Une voiture thermique, électrique?
La voiture de service que j'utilise, c'est une voiture électrique. C'est une e-tron.
Donc vous êtes plutôt bon élève dans ce matière-là. Pour beaucoup d'Européens, vous le savez, la voiture est indispensable dans leurs déplacements. Et certaines de vos propositions que vous avez brièvement évoquées tout à l'heure peuvent les inquiéter. Et c'est l'objet de la question de Gigi Donnelly de Radio 24. Buongiorno Gigi.
Buongiorno a voi, buongiorno Presidente.
Buongiorno.
Je vous en prie, posez votre question à Frans Timmermans.
Oui, la question c'est effectivement conséquente. Donc on parle notamment des nouvelles normes d'émissions de CO2 pour les voitures. Mais la question pour beaucoup c'est à terme, l'objectif de la Commission est de remplacer tous les modèles thermiques par des voitures électriques. Et si la réponse est positive, donc dans quelle échéance? Donc le 2030, 40, 50?
Bon, écoutez, moi pour vous dire toute la vérité, moi j'ai des amis, des copains qui me disent « j'ai jamais payé plus de 3 000 € pour une bagnole et maintenant tu me proposes d'acheter une voiture électrique qui me coûte 40 000 €. J'ai jamais ce fric pour faire ça. » Donc il faut quand même partir de la réalité des gens. Et là, ce qu'on doit faire, c'est d'introduire un système qui aide l'industrie automobilière d'aller vers des voitures sans émissions, surtout des voitures électriques. Mais ça veut dire qu'à certains points, l'industrie produira uniquement des voitures électriques. Mais il y aura un échantillon énorme de voitures thermiques encore sur le marché pour des décennies. Hein, même s'ils arrêtent à construire les voitures thermiques, il y en aura encore pour une très longue période. Donc ce qu'on doit faire, c'est d'aider, d'enlever les voitures les plus polluantes du marché et puis aider les citoyens à acheter des voitures. Il faut créer un marché pour les voitures électriques qui coûtent moins, etc., etc. Il faut faire ça, rendre ça accessible à tout le monde, parce que dans certaines régions, les gens n'ont pas le choix. Il faut augmenter, bien sûr, les transports en commun, il faut augmenter les transports en commun sans émissions, mais pour une certaine période, il faut aussi accepter le fait que les gens auront besoin de leur voiture. Et donc, la réglementation doit aider l'industrie d'aller vers des voitures sans émissions, mais en même temps, la réglementation doit aussi aider le remplacement de voitures les plus polluantes par des voitures moins polluantes.
Mais cette fin annoncée des voitures thermiques, vous devez bien avoir une petite idée. Elle est prévue pour quand, plus ou moins?
Ce qu'on veut faire, c'est d'augmenter la réglementation pour les émissions. Et puis, ça, je crois, poussera aussi l'industrie à dire, à certains moments, ce n'est plus intéressant pour nous pour faire des voitures thermiques. Mais avec ça, la voiture thermique ne disparaît pas tout de suite, c'est ce que je voulais dire. Hein. Et Bloomberg a analysé que vers 2027, la voiture électrique, qui déjà aujourd'hui est moins chère quand on l'a qu'une voiture thermique, la voiture électrique sera aussi moins chère dans l'achat. 2027, c'est pas très loin. Hein.
Dans 7 ans. Frans Timmermans, ce cap vert que vous souhaitez donner à l'économie européenne, eh bien, on le retrouve aussi dans les plans de relance qui ont été soumis par les États membres pour rebooster nos économies après la pandémie de Covid. Les plans de relance, ils sont là pour donner une nouvelle direction à nos économies, une direction numérique et une direction verte. Alors, vous avez déjà examiné plusieurs plans de relance et l'un des premiers pays à avoir reçu le feu vert de la Commission pour son plan de relance, c'est le Luxembourg. On retrouve notre collègue de Radio 100.7, Daniel Weber. Bonjour Daniel. Daniel, on vous voit mais on ne vous entend pas encore.
C'est la faute qu'on fait souvent de ne pas allumer le micro. Voilà, maintenant on y est. Donc évidemment, bonjour Frans Timmermans. Le plan de relance luxembourgeois a en effet été évalué très rapidement et il n'est sans doute pas le plus volumineux que la Commission a dû feuilleter, mais la question se pose si les projets proposés par les États membres, notamment dans le domaine du climat, peuvent vraiment tenir leurs promesses. Il y a eu des analyses, des plans nationaux, par exemple par le Wuppertal Institute et plusieurs universités qui ont trouvé qu'un tiers des projets n'auraient très probablement pas d'impact positif sur le climat. On parle de greenwashing et on demande à la Commission de ne pas approuver tous les projets. Alors j'aimerais vous demander combien vous en avez rejeté et pouvez-vous garantir que l'argent européen ne sera pas à la fin investi en réalité dans de l'éco-blanchiment?
Oui, on a eu un débat très intensif pendant des semaines et des semaines avec tous les États membres sur leurs projets. Et à l'instant, tous les programmes qu'on a accordés, je suis très content. Hein. Pour le Luxembourg, c'est plus de 60% des dépenses sera pour des politiques qui soutiennent notre politique sur le climat. Et aussi, autres pays, j'étais impressionné par la qualité des projets. Aussi, j'étais reconnaissant du fait qu'ils ont tous atteint le minimum qui était de 37% politique climat et 100% do no serious harm. C'est-à-dire, ça ne peut pas nuire aux objectifs que nous avons pour le climat. Donc là, je suis quand même assez satisfait avec ce qui a été proposé par les États membres. Je suis très content du dialogue qu'on a eu avec eux. C'était très constructif. Et maintenant, on passe à l'exécution. Et la Commission veillera étroitement à une exécution correcte des projets. Là, c'est une responsabilité qu'on a parce que, comme vous le dites clairement, il y a aussi dans certains quartiers, dans certains États membres, des doutes. Est-ce que ça, c'est vraiment ce qu'on veut atteindre? Donc on a une grande responsabilité et on le ressent en tant que Commission européenne pour assurer l'application correcte des projets qui ont été soumis.
Frans Timmermans, je vous propose à présent d'aller en Roumanie. Alors en fait non, nous n'allons pas aller en Roumanie parce que la connexion n'a pas pu être établie, mais ça ne fait rien parce que notre collègue Florine Orban de Radio Romana m'a envoyé sa question par écrit et je vais vous la lire. Elle porte aussi sur les plans de relance et le plan de relance roumain. Alors le plan de relance initial de la Roumanie ne semble pas convaincre la Commission car il contient trop d'investissements non verts comme des financements pour développer le réseau routier. Ces investissements sont pourtant indispensables pour assurer une relance qui bénéficie à tous les Roumains. Quelle est la proposition de la Commission ici ?
On travaille aussi étroitement avec les autorités roumaines. Vous savez qu'il y a eu au début des questions politiques, de politique interne, de pouvoir avancer correctement. Maintenant, je dois dire qu'on avance, et on avance bien. On n'exclut pas du tout la possibilité d'investir dans l'infrastructure physique, mais ça dépend complètement de la qualité. Parce que ça vous semble peut-être paradoxal, mais c'est possible, en construisant une route, qu'on réduit les émissions. C'est possible. Hein? Si cette route mène à un transport plus efficace, plus efficient, c'est quand même, ça aide de décarboner l'économie. Donc on n'est pas contre, mais ça dépend des conditions. Est-ce qu'on y ajoute une infrastructure pour le chargement électrique? Est-ce qu'on a bien pris en compte les conditions environnementales? C'est là qu'on observe les critères.
Mais est-ce que vous comprenez ce sentiment quelque part que des pays comme la Roumanie peuvent avoir, ce deux poids, deux mesures? Parce qu'on se souvient quand des pays comme l'Espagne ou le Portugal sont venus dans l'Union européenne, ils ont eu, grâce à des financements européens, tout leur réseau autoroutier construit. Et à ce moment-là, effectivement, il n'y avait pas de conditions qui étaient posées.
Si, il y avait des conditions qui étaient posées, aussi Natura 2000 et autres conditions qui ont été observées.
Elles n'étaient pas aussi fortes.
Pas aussi fortes que maintenant, mais en même temps, ça donne une opportunité incroyable aux Roumains d'investir dans leur pays. L'enveloppe financière est très considérable, mais il faut bien investir, il faut investir dans le futur. Et on est à la disposition des autorités roumaines pour faire ça très bien. Mais il est clair que parlant avec un pays membre comme le Luxembourg, on a d'autres choses à discuter que parlant avec un État membre comme la Roumanie. On est dans une situation différente. Mais en même temps, on essaie quand même d'aider le développement économique et social de la Roumanie et aussi d'augmenter la capacité d'absorption du pays et des investissements qui sont possibles.
Alors, transformer la société comme vous le proposez, cela se fait à coup de propositions politiques, comme celle que vous allez présenter le 14 juillet. Cela se fait à travers des objectifs clairement définis, mais cela ne peut pas se faire sans le soutien des citoyens. Et c'est la question que souhaite soulever ma collègue de la RTBF, Myriam Ball. Bonjour Myriam.
Bonjour et bonjour Monsieur Timmermans. La transition verte, Olivier le disait, passera par nous, les citoyens, qui allons devoir changer nos habitudes, nous déplacer autrement, on l'évoquait, isoler nos logements, et un certain nombre de ces changements-là vont avoir un coût. Alors comment pensez-vous convaincre les citoyens et puis aussi permettre à un maximum d'Européens d'amorcer ce combat-là?
Je crois premièrement qu'il y a un soutien, en principe, il y a un fort soutien des citoyens européens pour le Green Deal. Pourquoi? Parce qu'on voit déjà la crise climatique. On la voit, on la ressent. On voit le temps qu'il fait, on voit la sécheresse, on voit les feux, on le voit. Donc nos citoyens exigent de nous d'agir. Mais bien sûr, une fois qu'on agit, les conséquences seront pour tout le monde. Premièrement, je dirais qu'il faut assurer que la transition soit juste. Si la transition n'est pas juste, elle n'aura pas lieu parce qu'on perdra non seulement les personnes déjà en précarité, mais on perdra aussi les couches moyennes de la société. Donc il faut convaincre les gens que la transition est organisée de manière juste. C'est-à-dire que ceux qui polluent prennent leurs responsabilités. C'est-à-dire on fait un partage équitable à travers la société du fardeau qu'on a apporté. C'est-à-dire on aide avec un programme très, très large la transition énergétique des maisons, des bâtiments. On aide les gens à isoler leurs maisons, on aide les gens à changer le chauffage, etc., etc. Les programmes nationaux allant dans cette direction ont un soutien considérable. Mais je répète, si on n'a pas la capacité de prouver que c'est une transition équitable et juste et solidaire, elle n'aura pas lieu. Et la solidarité se joue entre États membres, mais aussi dans les États membres. Parce que si cette transition est perçue comme une transition qui aide les riches aux dépens des pauvres, elle n'aura pas lieu. Elle n'aura pas lieu. Donc on sait très bien à la Commission que nos propositions doivent être équitables, solidaires, sinon elles ne passeront jamais.
Mais est-ce que cette solidarité, la Commission européenne ne peut pas aussi la favoriser, l'aider? Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas des fonds
C'est ce qu'on fait. C'est ce qu'on fait. On a le fonds de la transition juste. On a tout un mécanisme pour cette transition juste. On veut aussi, si on décide d'élargir le système ETS au transport et en bâtiment, on veut créer un fonds social pour pouvoir, donc les revenus qui reviennent du système, en partie seront mis dans un fonds social qui pourra alors aider ceux qui sont touchés par les effets, par exemple pour éviter la pauvreté énergétique.
Écoutez, vous me faites une transition fantastique. Vous devriez faire de la radio parce qu'on va parler de ces échanges de quotas d'émissions, ce que vous avez évoqué, ETS, car pour faire baisser les émissions de gaz à effet de serre, l'Union européenne a mis en place justement un système d'échange de quotas d'émissions, en clair, un marché du carbone où les entreprises vendent ou achètent des droits à polluer. Et vous êtes, on l'a entendu, assez fiers de ce système, sauf que pour l'instant, il ne touche que les entreprises, et encore certaines entreprises. Et c'est la question de notre collègue Pedro Cairo de Radio Renaissance. Hola Pedro, tudo bem? Voilà, tudo bem.
Hola, bonjour à Monsieur Timmermans et à tous. Je veux savoir, est-ce qu'étendre le système d'échange de quotas d'émissions au transport, ce n'est pas un moyen de faire payer les citoyens plutôt que l'industrie automobile? Est-ce que la Commission subit la pression de l'industrie automobile? Merci.
Je crois qu'on est tous dans ce jeu. Je crois que le problème du secteur du transport est que les émissions augmentent encore. Et donc, il faut quand même changer cette logique. On le fait en augmentant les exigences pour l'industrie automobilière. On le fait aussi peut-être en introduisant un système d'ETS. on doit réduire le coût. Parce que je viens d'expliquer, on aide l'industrie automobilière d'aller vers des voitures électriques. Mais pour des décennies, il y aura encore des voitures thermiques sur le marché. Donc il faut aussi assurer que, que les voitures thermiques font leur part pour réduire les émissions. Et pour ça, on pourrait introduire un système ETS pour les transports. Si on ne le fait pas, on devra faire un autre choix. Ou bien ajouter une taxe sur le carburant, ou bien une réglementation supplémentaire. Mais tout ça touchera toujours les citoyens. Ça touchera toujours les citoyens. Ce que je crois qu'on peut faire avec un système ETS, c'est d'organiser ça de façon plus solidaire, plus juste, parce que ça nous donne des revenus qu'on peut mettre tout de suite à la disposition de ceux qui sont injustement touchés par les mesures. Ce qu'on ne peut pas faire aussi facilement avec une réglementation ou avec une taxe.
Il y a une question que Pedro posait aussi. Est-ce que, on voit bien que les changements que vous mettez sur la table sont énormes, sont très ambitieux et qui vont bouleverser l'organisation de plusieurs entreprises. On pense notamment aux industries automobiles. Est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, la Commission reçoit une pression de la part de ces industriels pour justement mettre un petit peu d'eau dans votre vin et faire en sorte que vous ne mettiez pas en danger l'industrie automobile européenne?
Mais toutes les industries, tous ceux qui ont un intérêt nous approchent avec leur position. C'est logique, c'est mon boulot de les recevoir, de parler avec eux, de leur expliquer ce qu'on fait, de les écouter, de voir ce qu'on peut faire. Mais je dois dire, dans l'automobile, il y a 2 ans, il y avait une attitude vraiment contre. Non, vous allez trop loin, on peut encore créer des voitures thermiques encore plus performantes, vous exagérez, etc., etc. Mais j'ai vraiment l'impression depuis moins d'1 an, qu'ils ont vraiment tourné un cap. Qu'ils se sont dit, oui, on voit maintenant où ça va. On voit que pour les voitures, on aura besoin d'aller vers des voitures électriques. Et que pour les poids lourds, on devra aller vers des poids lourds zéro émission basés sur l'hydrogène ou autres solutions. Donc, ils ont compris. Et maintenant, ils nous demandent, aidez-nous à faire cette transition. Et là, bien sûr, c'est une industrie incroyable, ceux qui travaillent dans cette industrie. Donc, il faut quand même aider cette industrie à avoir la capacité de se transformer vers la production de voitures électriques, qui donne aussi une possibilité incroyable pour l'industrie européenne.
Frans Timmermans, on va arriver au terme de cette émission. On en retiendra que vous ne possédez pas de voiture, mais que vous vous faites conduire en voiture électrique. J'ai
aussi une voiture. Hein.
Ah, ça vous l'avez pas dit.
Non, je dois avouer, j'ai une voiture. C'est même une vieille diesel qu'on doit vendre.
On retiendra aussi que pour vous, les États membres ont rempli leur mission avec les plans de relance, notamment en y intégrant cette dimension verte, et que pour assurer cette transition écologique juste, ça doit passer par des aides aux Européens les plus pauvres, grâce notamment aux revenus tirés du système d'échange de quotas d'émissions. Une dernière question philosophique pour terminer. Vous avez 30 secondes pour répondre. Attention, normalement, ça aurait été 2 heures. L'Europe se fera dans les crises, prophétisait Jean Monnet. On est en plein dedans, hein, la pire crise que l'on ait connue depuis la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Est-ce que ce sera suffisant pour construire une nouvelle économie européenne durable, ou est-ce que le risque du retour au monde d'avant est toujours bien présent?
Si on prend au sérieux l'intérêt de nos enfants et petits-enfants, on assurera qu'il n'y aura pas de retour vers l'économie du passé.
Merci Frans Timmermans d'avoir accepté notre invitation.
Avec plaisir.
Hello, welcome back to this EURANET Plus Summit. We're here live today. Now we move into the English-speaking version of the summit indeed. My name is Beatriz Rios. I am a reporter with EURANET Plus in Brussels, and today I'm thrilled to be joined in the studio by the Executive Vice President for the EU Green Deal, Frans Timmermans.
Hello.
Hello there. So today we're going to be joined by our colleagues from all across Europe. They are going to be sharing their questions with the Executive Vice President. They do an amazing job in trying to bring together the European politics into their local realities and also to try to bring those local realities into the European politics. We're going to be hearing from Magdalena Zbrazka, who is from Polski Radio in Poland, from Dobromir Bindev, who is from BNR in Bulgaria, Balázs Narai from NTVA in Hungary, and Claudia Pnocke from AMS in Germany, and Lidja Petkovic from RTV in Slovenia. They are all there joining us today. Again, they do an amazing job in bringing politics closer to the citizens today. We're going to be hearing from them in a minute, but the first question is going to be for me. We have been hearing over the past few days, over the past few weeks, there has been a strong negotiation on a number of aspects, and we have been seeing both when in the question of the common agricultural policy, but also other policies in the Union, that the position of different member states is very much against the ambitious goals that we have been setting by the European Commission. Even today, we hear that the German agriculture minister was very strongly attacking you, saying that the Commission has been not playing a role of an honest broker in the negotiation of the common agriculture policy. And my question is, first of all, how do you take these attacks against the Commission and yourself? And second, how do you see the progression of the EU green policy when you see that member states are strongly opposing some of those policies indeed?
Well, if I listen to the German minister, clearly Germany is already in an electoral mode. We have been working very constructively with the co-legislators to get an agreement on the common agricultural policy. The role of the Commission is indeed to work on an agreement between the co-legislators, obviously on the basis of our proposal. We defend our proposal as well. And being constructive doesn't mean just saying yes to everything the Council comes up with. We also have the European Parliament in this game. And there's three institutions in this game, and our goal is to bring the three together. You know, that's give and take. And everybody needs to move on that. So I can't take that attack very seriously. And it's clear she wasn't speaking. She pretended she was speaking on behalf of all the ministers, which was clearly not the case.
But more generally, when we see that there is a strong stand on a number of member states against some of the progressive policies the Commission is putting forward, particularly on the Green Deal, and when we see that those positions, they go very much against the goals of achieving to the climate neutrality in 2050, that from this week we expect it to be law. How is the Commission reacting? Because in the end, you have to be the guardian of the treaties and all this legislation that you're putting forward. How do you go into a negotiation like the common agricultural policy and trying to make sure that it's in line with the objectives of the EU Green Deal while respecting the negotiations?
Well, our proposal, the proposal we put on the table was in line with the Green Deal, can be brought in line with the Green Deal. This applies also with the farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy we put on the table. Now we're negotiating, and Parliament is also demanding certain changes. I'm hopeful that we can come to a conclusion soon on these negotiations, and then we will be able to see whether this is still in line with our ambitions on the Green Deal. I think it's still possible to get us there, and we will certainly be working on that. But more generally, not just on the common agricultural policy, also on the Fit for 55, we will make a proposition, a proposal of 12 proposals on the 14th of July. It's then up to member states to say whether they like them or not. Some they will like, some they will like less. Some member states will like one, some other member states will like the other. That's part of the game in the European Union. And my only question is, if you don't like a measure, do you have an alternative? Because the minus 55% emissions in 2030, you have agreed to. That's even set into law. So if you don't like this measure, what other measure will you bring to the market to make sure that we do reach our goals? That's the way we have to approach this issue.
Absolutely. We're going to be talking about the Fit for 55 proposals that you're going to be tabling very soon. But one of the issues that has been coming very strongly from our network is the fact that people are very worried about the social impact that these green policies are going to have on regular people. And so now we're going to be joined from Bulgaria by Dragomir Videv. He's a journalist from the Bulgarian National Radio, and he has indeed a question about this issue. Welcome.
Yes. Welcome. Thank you very much. In Bulgaria, there are many households that cannot afford the energy prices, for example, for heating, and how the EU and the Commission could assure us that the fund for energy poor households will not be misused by the politicians, for example, in power. So do you think some kind of binding the energy transitioning funds with the rule of law, for example?
Well, I think it is important that we help this energy transition also by supporting people, for instance, to insulate their housing, to go to another source of energy. In some cases, in Bulgaria, but also in other countries, the transition away from coal and wood to renewable energy is just one step too far. So we'll have to take an intermediary step in bringing natural gas into people's homes so that they can use that for heating. And then we have to make sure that we do it in such an efficient way that energy poverty is not an issue. I believe this can be done. I believe we can work closely with all member states to make this happen. But it's a transition. It's a fundamental transition. And like in any transition, there is anxiety. Anxiety, am I going to be part of the positive side of the transition or not? We have to make sure that this transition is just. If it's not just, if it's not based on solidarity, it will just not happen. So we all have an interest in making sure that there's no energy poverty, that the transition helps people to pay less for energy, not more, and that it is done in a fair way.
So not only the question of the social impact of these policies, but as you were talking about the question of energy mix, I was thinking that there is another controversy here because we have seen that the positions between the member states vary quite a lot. While in the treaties we know that the energy mix is up to the member states, we see that you have tens in Germany advocating for the end of nuclear energy, whereas in France they very much defend this question. There is the question of gas as well. How do you face this debate, considering that you also have to come up with a concrete proposal on the EU taxonomy, on the question of what is green and what it doesn't, and how do you see these as a part of making sure that the EU as well has more independency when it comes to the energy supply?
Well, what is renewable and what is not renewable is very clear. Natural gas is not renewable, but it is a lot cleaner than coal. So it does help us in the transition from coal to renewable energy. So natural gas can be a very useful method to transit from coal to renewables. But you have to be careful not to be locked into natural gas forever. It's only transitional. Nuclear energy has a huge advantage of having zero emissions, but it's not renewable. You still need fuel for it, and afterwards you're left with the used fuel that you need to take care of, and it is incredibly expensive to invest in. So we are technology neutral at the European Commission. We only hope that member states would make rational choices based on the need to decarbonize our energy mix. At the end of the day, our energy resources need to be zero carbon. And that's what we're working for. And some member states will choose to go for nuclear energy. Many others will choose not to go for nuclear energy. That's up to them. But when you define what is renewable, you have to be honest. Nuclear energy is not renewable. Natural gas is not renewable.
Do you see the potential of renewable energies to make sure that the EU is less dependent of other countries when it comes to energy?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the price development of offshore wind, for instance, and solar, it's becoming almost cheaper by the day. You then have to make a comparison. What does solar cost me if I invest in that, and what does nuclear cost me if I invest in that? And then make a rational choice between the two. Already now you see coal disappearing very quickly from the energy mix simply because it's too expensive, apart from the fact that it's very polluting. So the price development of renewable energy is really driving an investment program that is amazing into renewable energy. Having said all that, we will also have renewable energy-based energy carriers like hydrogen, which will be necessary for difficult to abate sectors in transport and in industry. And hydrogen will be produced in the European Union, but also in countries that we partner up with outside of the European Union, whether it's to the east or in Africa. And I believe this is also an opportunity both for Europe and for Africa.
We'll say about that. We're going to get back to the question of the social impact of the green policies, and we're going to be joined from Budapest by our colleague Balázs Narai from NTVA, the public national radio in Hungary. So you have the floor, Balázs.
Hello, good afternoon, illetve good evening. Thank you for the opportunity. My question is related partly to the question of Dobromir from Bulgaria, which is about who pays and how much to pay, because the question is then who should bear the costs of the ecological transition. In a market economy, finally the customers pay, but the question is whether the citizens pay directly or the big polluters like big companies should pay the costs.
Well, I'm afraid it's not that black and white. I think everybody should pay their share. Much of the cost is now borne by industry. But cost borne by industry, at the end of the day, also ends up with the consumers. The only question is, how do you do this in a fair way? How do you influence people's behavior to move towards a zero-emission society and zero-emission economy? And yet you have to organize it in such a way that it is fair, that you prevent energy poverty. And that's why we are proposing a whole host of measures, from extending potentially the ETS system to looking at the energy consumption of buildings, to looking at the emission requirements for cars, etc., etc., etc. The complete overview of all these measures needs to lead to a transition that is seen objectively as fair, and that everybody can do their part, and that everybody can see that others are doing their part as well. Because I don't believe the issue of a transition is questioned by people. The issue of a fair transition is questioned by people. What is asked of me is that also asked of somebody else. If I'm asked to do something, is that fair in relationship to what others are asked to do? If I, as consumer, am doing something, what is asked of industry, is that also fair? And we need to prove step by step that what we're asking is fair. If we can't prove that, people will not support us.
About that question of fairness, I know that our colleague from Germany wants to ask as well. We're going to be joined now by Claudia Nopke, who is a journalist at IMS, a network of local radios in Germany. No, Claudia, you have the floor.
Yeah, and thank you. Well, when it comes to the costs, it is a big question over here in Germany too. So it's important for a so-called rich country as well. Let's take, for example, Switzerland, where the people just voted against the CO2 law because too expensive. Here in Germany, many are calling for climate justice. They demand for climate policy not to become a class policy. On the other hand, it is quite fancy to be member of the Green Deal, but you have to have the means to be able to afford to participate. And you very often have to have the knowledge in order to deal properly with the Green Deal. So I would like to know, how will the Commission make sure that the Green Deal will not become an elite project?
You know who's going to be the victim if we don't change? You know what the cost is of non-action? You know who's going to suffer most if we have wildfires and droughts and floods? It's not the elites, it's not the rich people, it's the people who have nowhere to go. You know who's going to suffer most if some industries disappear because the climate conditions can no longer support them? Who are going to lose their jobs? Not the elites, ordinary people. So if you talk about the cost of the transition, you should also be fair and talk about the cost of non-transition. And I think the cost of non-transition, both in financial terms, but especially in human terms, that cost is unacceptable. And the cost of transition will be borne if we can prove that this cost is borne equally in society, that it's done in a based on solidarity in a fair way, that people who are vulnerable are protected, that people who are at risk of energy poverty are supported, etc., etc. If we can prove that, then this transition will happen. Because the biggest illusion we need to get rid of is the illusion that by doing nothing, everything will stay as it is today. It's an illusion. We already see the climate crisis is already upon us. Talk to farmers about the droughts they experience. Look at the wildfires that we've seen. Go to Spain and look at the gota fria that happens almost every year now. These are the consequences of the climate crisis, and we need to address them. This transition is necessary if humanity wants to remain in control of its own destiny. And of course there are costs involved, but the costs of doing nothing are much higher. Our task as Commission, but also as national authorities, is to assure that these costs are distributed evenly and fairly in our society, because the benefits later, better jobs, cleaner air, better agricultural production, clean transport, the benefits are huge. And in terms of jobs, 2 million extra jobs, that's huge.
We've been here for quite some time, and the question still is the same. So we have the perception all across Europe that this transition is being very costly for those poorer people, those weaker peoples who are more exposed to the consequences, both social but also in terms of practical terms. So I was wondering, how do you, first of all, how you convince people that this is the way forward? Because those people are demonstrating in the street. We have seen it with the Gilets jaunes. Sometimes that has led to social unrest. And second of all, are enough the means that we have right now on the table to tackle the social consequences of this green transition that is so necessary?
Don't underestimate our citizens. They know this transition is necessary. They know it. They worry about the fact whether this is going to be fair. But if I were in a situation where people weren't even convinced that we need to do something about the climate crisis, I would be really in trouble. But people know we need to do something. Now, it's up to us to prove that what we're doing is fair, and that what we're doing is difficult for everyone, but we do it in a way that everybody can be part of it. Even though we're asking something of people, they can see that we're asking it in a fair way, and the people that can do more will be asked to do more, and the people who can do less will be supported so that they don't have to do more. This is on us to prove. But the starting position is not a bad one, because our citizens know that this is a crisis we can't close our eyes on. There is no vaccine against the climate crisis. We need to change the way we live, the way we work, the way we move around, etc., etc.
Absolutely. I wanted to get back to the question of the support that we have seen, especially at European level, because recently you mentioned during an intervention before the Economic and Social Committee that you were willing to put a new fund to tackle the potential impact of extending that ETS system that we were talking about. Yes. Considering that we have already a multi-annual financial framework and EU a long-term budget, that we have already the recovery fund in place, where would that money come from? Can we expect new resources from the side of the European Commission? In which direction are we moving, and how are we going to tackle those potential consequences in the longer term that we didn't foresee?
Well, if you decide to create an ETS system for buildings and for transport, that of course will lead to revenues, like it does with the industry. You can then decide to use part of those revenues to put that into a social fund. That social fund could then be used, for instance, to address issues of energy poverty, to address issues of mobility shortages, etc. That would then have to be decided by the member states in the cases that are particularly affected by this ETS system. So I believe a social fund is the right way to make sure that the revenues you get out of an ETS system go back to the people who need it most.
Absolutely. So we couldn't be joined by our colleagues from the Spanish radio, Es Radio from Castilla y León, but we had a question from them. They were wondering what the Commission is putting forward to support those areas that are the most affected by the green transition, particularly those where active mines are still very important for the economy of the region.
We have in Europe still about 30 coal mining regions. This is both coal and lignite. All these regions know that there's no future in coal, And all these regions rightly demand a transition that will offer them new opportunities in the future. So we will have to make sure that we come up with plans in the Just Transition Fund, with the Just Transition Mechanism, with the structural funds, and with other means to make sure we invest in the economy of the future for coal mining regions. I am relatively optimistic for most coal mining regions because of the demographics. We will need everyone in the economy of the future. I already said 2 million jobs in the new economy, but people have to be skilled for those jobs. So we have to make sure we skill and reskill people who until now have worked in the mining industry to do another job. We also have to make sure we create the right infrastructure so that industries have an interest in investing in coal mining regions. This can all happen. And particularly in Spain, what worries me most in Spain is youth unemployment. And we have to make sure that young people in countries with high levels of youth unemployment get the skills, get the tools to take the jobs that are coming. And I think that there's a mismatch today in the labour market. We need to address that issue.
Absolutely, and I think that it's very interesting to point to the question of education and the skilling, which we haven't touched upon, but especially in those countries that there is not only a challenge, but also a lot of potential for growth in the green transition. We're going to move to another coal mining area, to Poland, for another question, but this time on the carbon adjust mechanism. We're joined by Magdalena Zvezka, who is from Polski Radio. Magdalena, you have the floor. Magdalena, we cannot hear you.
All right.
There we go.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Vice President. I'd like to ask you about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or carbon border tax, as it is often called, as the European Commission obviously is working on the details of this measure. Firstly, there has been already some reports circulating about potential sectors that might be targeted by the tariff. Could you tell us a bit more about it, and which countries might be most affected by these measures? We know that countries like China, Brazil, India are particularly concerned about this measure. And secondly, do you think that it's possible to get the US on board to support such a measure? We know from the Special US Envoy on Climate, John Kerry, that President Biden is exploring this idea to fight climate change. So do you think the EU and the US could indeed join hands in supporting this kind of mechanism? Thank you.
Well, what is it intended to do, the carbon border adjustment mechanism? It has one goal and one goal only: to prevent carbon leakage, to prevent from industries who don't like the European measures from moving elsewhere and then undercutting our emission goals by continuing to produce with a lot of emissions somewhere else. So that's the goal. If other countries take measures comparable to ours, which is putting a price on carbon, whether you do it through an ETS system or through taxation or through regulation, doesn't matter. If you put a price on carbon, you avoid unbalancing the level playing field. And then you avoid having to be hit by a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I believe this is why do we get so much discussion about this? Because our major partners are thinking about, oh wow, what is this? What is this going to mean for me? Are the Europeans going to slap tariffs on me, etc., etc.? But we say, if you, who have all signed the Paris Agreement, take the measures to decarbonize your economy, which is another way of saying to put a price on carbon, if you do that, then there is no need for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I'm not so sure whether the Americans will actually opt for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. They might find other ways of creating a level playing field. So I'm not sure they will do that, but they do understand the logic. They started by being very dismissive of the idea, and now they're more understanding of the idea, but I'm not sure they will opt for the same solution. I'd rather think they won't. But they might think in terms of other solutions, at least to make it unnecessary for the European Union and the United States to have some form of carbon border adjustment between them. I think given the ambitions of the Biden administration, I would assume that there would be no need for carbon border adjustment.
Is the Commission looking in the potential impact of such a mechanism for developing countries that might not be so advanced in climate policy?
Absolutely. Our ambition is to create a system that is in conformity with WTO rules. And that immediately means that you have a responsibility to look at the effects for third countries, including developing countries. What we don't want is to create a situation where it becomes interesting for polluting industries to move to those countries so that they can export freely to the European Union. What we also don't want is to affect negatively the growth potential of developing countries. So we have to look very carefully at that, and we have the interest of the developing countries very much at heart.
Difficult balance there. We're going to move now to Slovenia, where we are going to be joined by our colleague Lidia Petkovic, who is going to be asking a new question about the topic that we haven't touched upon before, but is very important, which is biodiversity.
Yes, hello, the Vice President, and of course everyone present. As you know, Slovenia will be the European climate leader in the second half of this year as part of its EU presidency. And conserving biodiversity will also be an important priority. We know that the European Union did not meet its biodiversity targets for 2020. Mr. Vice President, what do you think went wrong? And if I touch on a recent update, as we know, the European Union has been urged to implement legally binding ambitious targets to protect biodiversity. A question on this: how ready do you think is the Commission to defend strong EU action against the pressure from industry lobbyists in individual states?
Well, we are very much committed to protecting biodiversity. It's a matter of survival. If we don't do something about biodiversity loss, we will lose 1 million species. And that directly is a threat to our health and our survival as humanity. You know, we've seen with COVID that zoonosis is so close. If we don't have a balanced relationship with our natural environment, nature is no longer able to neutralize viruses before they reach human beings. And so we have a direct interest in terms of our survival to do much better on protecting our biodiversity. Why is biodiversity, our goals haven't been reached? It has to do with a number of factors. It has to do with our agricultural policy. It has to do with our industry policy. It has to do with the infrastructure, etc., that we build. But the European Commission is very firm in its ambition to fulfill our goals of having 30% protected areas on land and on sea. This was also our ambition leading into the COP15 in Kunming in China on biodiversity. Let's see when that will take place. But we have an ambition to fulfill, and we have increasing support from the member states to do that. And the European Commission will not hesitate, once this is agreed with our member states, to also impose the rules vis-à-vis industry and others when they don't abide by the rules.
We're getting closer to the end of this EURANET Plus Summit, and the last question is an obvious one. In July, you're going to be presenting the Fit for 55 package, where you're going to present a number of initiatives and reforms of the already existing legislation to make sure that we achieve that reduction of 55% of the emissions by 2030. We have seen a lot of resistance on member states' attempts to influence the Commission in what legislation is going to be putting forward. Can you give us a hint of what are those measures and what are the major ideas that we're going to see from that package?
Well, you know, because we have to move from -40 to -55, that's a sea change. That's not a small change, it's a fundamental change, and we only have 9 years to get there. So in many areas, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's renewable energy transition, whether it's emissions of cars and vans, whether it's the ETS or potentially extending the ETS, we will have to come forward with some quite far-reaching measures, because otherwise we will never get there. And I always say to member states, if you don't like the measures, give us an alternative, because you are committed to reducing the emissions with at least 55%. And you need to be committed to that, because otherwise we can't reach climate neutrality by 2050. And we need to reach it by 2050, because otherwise the climate crisis will get completely out of our control. So, you know, if you don't like one measure, give us another measure that you like better and see if you can get a majority for that. But at first, just have a look at the package we present. It is a holistic approach to the problem, and we believe this is the best balance we can create to get us where we need to be.
What is it that we're going to be looking into when you present the package in mid-July? I have to try. I'm here for that.
Yes, you're here for that, and I'm here to tell you that this is the extent of what I can tell you today, and you will have a lot to report on the 14th of July.
Looking forward to that indeed. Thank you so much for being here today with us. Thank you to our colleagues for participating and joining us live from all across Europe with those questions that our citizens were looking forward to have an answer. And thank you to our viewers for being here today with us in this EURANET Plus Summit. That's it from us. Thank you so much and see you soon.